James Young joining us here at the Rock Reader Underneath the Riffs book launch. Mate, well done to you and Miranda and Jeff and everybody else involved. It's a great launch and a great book.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's a pleasure to be on Melbourne Rock City, because in some respects the book Rock Reader Volume 1 Underneath the Riffs is about the fact that Melbourne is a rock city, and you're doing your job online to try to tell stories about music and keep music alive through storytelling and interviews and that journey. And Miranda and I are trying to do the same through the book, and it's a great opportunity to speak to people, not always people on stage, but the little people, those of us who love rock and roll, but have see amazing things, and we want to share these stories. And it was just a pleasure to sort of read 32 stories, and there'll be more and more as time comes, that I'd never heard before, that have never been told before, they've never been in Rolling Stone, they've never been in street press, never been told in interviews, and these stories are now on the page for people to enjoy forevermore.
Jonathan Alley joining us here as the party continues in the background. It's Rock Reader Underneath the Riffs launch party here at the Triple R Performance Space. Mate, contributor to the book. How does it feel to be a contributor to such an amazing bunch of people that were up there on the stage?
Feels lovely. I wrote this chapter about 3 years ago and thought it was a great idea, and then I forgot about it. And then I got an email that there was going to be this party, and I thought, that's right, I wrote that story in that book all those years ago. And I went back and I reread the chapter that I'd written, and I thought to myself that I didn't regret a word, because everything I wrote in the chapter about the band that I was writing about, the Black Eyed Susan, still rings true to me today, and everything about how all the venues I wrote about in the book, how the character of those venues has changed, but in some way the character of those venues, even though those venues are no longer there, is still present in Melbourne. And it's basically that in this city you can have a ratbag stage and a flea bag carpet and some half-drunken musicians stand up on stage and still create incredibly special moments. And it doesn't matter what kind of drinks you got behind the bar. It doesn't matter whether there's 5 people there or 500 people there. There is an incredible spirit of live music that makes this city. And the other sort of thesis in the chapter, in my chapter, if you like, is that Melbourne is a city of blow-ins. That there's 3 or 4 million people in Melbourne, and if you took out all the bands and all the broadcasters and writers like myself, or all the venue managers and punters who weren't from Melbourne, the live music scene here would be very, very different. And I think it's such an important thing that nobody talks about. It's where all the blow-ins come. Like the Black Eyed Susans have a song about coming to Melbourne where the weather suits their clothes. And I thought that was perfect.
And we've found Brian DeCourcy here. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
You're looking very dapper, very sharp.
Well, I'm just a little bit under the weather.
Really?
Very good red wine tonight.
Oh, that's not being under the weather. That's being fantastic, isn't it?
I'm a 2-pot screamer, come on.
Now, Rock Reader Underneath the Riffs here behind us, you mentioned that you know all of the contributing authors.
Molly Meldrum has been my friend since school, who I managed all through Countdown. Paul Stewart, the Herald Sun. Paddy Donovan, the Age, is probably the greatest rock writer in the country at the moment. He's a good friend of mine. Paul Elliott, who formed the polyester label when indie labels were a bad word. Paul's written in it. And Debbie Dinosaur, who was probably the first female club DJ. She's written it.
We had a bit of a chat to Debbie before. She's quite a character.
Well, she is. I mean, and everything you hear from her is true.
Denise joining me here at Rock Reader Behind the Riffs book launch. How are you?
I'm very well.
Now, contributing author, you must have, were you up on the stage getting the photo?
I had a photo, and I must say, if you look at the photos, Molly was groping me, which is very rare, but Molly was groping me. That's the love we share for each other.
That's a bit of, a bit of goss there. There you go.
That's a bit of goss, yeah.
Groping a lady. Now, let's get into your story with Depeche Mode and leaving Australia to just want to go on tour with the band.
Yeah, I wanted to tour with the band, and I ended up with Depeche, and I didn't know Depeche Mode, because in Australia they're not very big. They're huge overseas, but not very big here. And so I left, saw the world, but came back because I decided there's no place like home. Mine's the fairy floss story of the book. Everyone else is pretty rock. Mine's fairy floss.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
Sarah Morgan joining me here, a contributor to Rock Reader Behind the Riffs. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Ben. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Are you having a good time tonight? Everyone seems to be.
Great. It's seeing all these people I haven't seen for ages, and I was just saying, it's just like, A lot of us tend to go home a bit earlier these days, but it's great to come out and see everyone and reminisce about the old times.
Yeah, well,
some of us are still trying to live like we did in the olden days, but we'll grow up one day, promise.
well, James called an extra 2 hours on the bar, so I think people are going to stay here for a bit while longer. And your job at one time was looking after, was hanging out with the boys with Faith No More.
Correct. It was Billy Gould's 30th birthday, and his mum rang me from the States going, look, Billy's going to be in Melbourne the night of his actual birthday, and we really need you to put on a party for him. And she sent me money to buy him the best champagne. And I said, well, hell, we'll organise a cake. And we did, and it was really good fun.
Nice. And US dollars too, so you could have had double the fun.
Yeah. Back then.
I think this book is a book that you can go back to, and you can find new moments in this book. Funny, it's entertaining, there's pathos, there's sadness, because there's characters in the book that aren't here anymore, which is inevitable, I guess. But, I think it's a great collection of rock and roll stories, and it's not rock and roll stories for the sake of entertainment, it's rock and roll stories for the fucking sake of rock and roll.
I mean, I think rock and roll's been around so long now, it's not a generational thing. I mean, it's been going almost 60 years. I mean, and one of the great rock cities of the world is this little town called Melbourne. And it's interesting to note that rock and roll, as you know, is an American music. It's an American culture. But the first place in the world outside of America to embrace it was the city of Melbourne. In fact, the first ever rock and roll band in Australia came from Melbourne. The first ever rock and roll dance in Melbourne in Australia came out of Melbourne.
And also, from what I understand, Melbourne was the first to record rock and roll music?
Yes, it was. It was the first place in the world outside of America to record rock and roll music way back in 1955 on a label called Planet, run by a man called Bob Crawford, who at 83 at the moment is trying to be the new Lord Mayor of Melbourne.
Well, we're going to have to vote for him, aren't we?
Oh, we certainly are.
It will definitely be called Melbourne Rock City then. What do you think this book is going to do for the younger generation of Aussie rockers in Australia, and just kids that don't really know too much about the history of music in Melbourne?
Do you know what? I hope it's going to give them some kind of insight into what the industry's like. You know a lot about the industry, you know.
I know enough.
Yeah, so there's true stories and there's not so true stories. This is true story. So if you read between all the mysterious meanings, I think you get a good insight of what the music industry's like.
I agree with that point, because you can read a book written by a rock journalist and someone who's a good writer, and you appreciate the fact that they know how to spell and they're good at grammar. But after like 200 pages, it starts to flatline a bit, because there's a certain pace about how they write. You read a collection of 32 short stories, and you've got some guy who's a carpenter, some guy who's a lawyer, some other guy who happens to be a journo, someone is the cleaner at the Espy, and each one of them writes in a different style. And Miranda was insistent in the book that she edited. She said, I'm not going to change how you write. In fact, Wally Meanies' story has no capital letters or no punctuation, and in some respects it should be regarded as like a classic Japanese poem, because it just reads like a stream of consciousness. And I think Rolling Stone reviewed the book, and I'm glad they did, and they said, it's a little bit clunky, but they bring it together. And I say, fuck, we love clunky. Bring on the clunk. We like the fact that it's inconsistent.
We do love clunk, and I think also, to finish it off, is there's a particular section in the book. At one point, I think it was 1965. I may have the date wrong, but in the 60s, Melbourne actually had a bigger music scene than London.
Yeah, Melbourne Rock City, buddy. You know it. I know it. You know it. Melbourne fucking Rock City.